A heartless millionaire abandoned his newborn daughter because of her strange physical features. Years later, the daughter did the same thing to him when her eyes were two different colors. The midwife barely masked her hesitation as she swaddled the newborn, the candlelight casting elongated shadows across the grand, gold-trimmed bedchamber. The flickering glow illuminated the child's face, one eye a deep, warm brown, the other a striking shade of blue. Unnatural, some might say. Unsettling, others would whisper. The midwife swallowed hard. "She's healthy," she murmured, wrapping the baby tighter in the soft cotton blanket. But as she turned, she met the sharp gaze of Christina Howell, who had been watching intently from across the room. The elder matriarch stepped forward, her silk gown whispering against the marble floor. She looked down at the baby, her lips pressing into a thin, disapproving line. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Then, with deliberate slowness, she exhaled. "She has the devil's mark." The midwife flinched, shifting the baby instinctively in her arms. "Mother," a voice cut in. Richard Howell, standing near the window, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. "That's absurd." But Christina barely acknowledged him. Her gaze remained locked on the infant, her fingers tightening around the strings of her pearl necklace. "No Howell has ever been born like this," she said, her voice smooth but laced with something sharp. "This is not a blessing. This is a curse." Richard hesitated. A storm brewed in his chest, clashing between reason and the weight of his mother's words. He turned his head toward the bed, where his wife, Heather, lay unconscious, her golden hair damp against the pillow, her breathing steady but shallow. She had nearly died bringing this child into the world. A daughter. Richard's jaw clenched. A daughter wouldn't carry the Howell legacy. A daughter wouldn't inherit the estate, the business, the name. And now, this child, with her unnatural eyes, would only be a stain on their lineage. Christina took a step closer, her voice soft now, almost coaxing. "You know what people will say," she murmured, resting a hand lightly on his forearm. "They'll talk, they'll whisper, they'll call her an omen, and they will question your judgment, Richard. Our family's legacy cannot be tainted by superstition and scandal." The midwife shifted, uneasy, glancing at the baby's face before looking back at Richard. "Sir, she's just a child, a perfectly healthy—" Christina's eyes snapped to her. "Leave us." The woman hesitated, but knew better than to disobey. With a last reluctant glance at the newborn, she bowed her head and hurried from the room. Silence hung between mother and son. Then Christina spoke again, quieter this time. "We can fix this." Richard looked down at the baby now resting in his arms. Small, fragile, unaware of the weight of her existence. His fingers tightened around the fabric of the blanket. His decision was made. The night was cold, the city streets wet with the remnants of a passing rain. The servant moved quickly, his coat wrapped tightly around him, the bundled infant clutched to his chest. The orphanage lay just beyond the square, its stone walls towering like a solemn guardian in the darkness. Inside, a lone candle burned at the desk of Madame Eliza, the head mistress, who barely looked up as the man entered. These kinds of visits were not uncommon. "A girl," the servant muttered, placing the baby into the wicker cradle by the fire. "She—" He hesitated, but what was the point? The girl was nobody now. She was unwanted. Madame Eliza sighed through her nose, adjusting the worn shawl around her shoulders. "Aren't they all?" she murmured, before reaching for her ledger. "Does she have a name?" The servant hesitated. Then, shaking his head, he turned and walked away. The door clicked shut behind him. The Howell estate was silent when Olivia Carter, the head maid, slipped through the kitchen entrance. Her heart was hammering against her ribs as she pulled the hood of her cloak down and moved toward the staircase. She had followed him, the man Richard had sent. She had watched as the baby was abandoned, as the child was left behind like an inconvenience. And she had known she couldn't let it happen. She begged Eliza to let her take care of the child, just take care of it, nothing dark. Eliza saw the sincerity in Olivia's eyes. She nodded slightly. Olivia's hands trembled as she held the tiny bundle close, shielding the infant from the cold air that crept through the cracks in her modest home. Her own bedroom was small, the furniture worn but sturdy, the scent of lavender lingering in the air. She placed the baby gently on the bed, her breath uneven as she pulled the blanket back. The child blinked up at her, one brown eye, one blue. A lump formed in Olivia's throat. How could anyone discard something so pure? She brushed her fingertips softly over the baby's cheek. "You were supposed to be a Howell," she whispered. "But now, you're mine." She sat on the edge of the bed, exhaustion and disbelief washing over her. A maid stealing away a child of wealth and status. It was madness. But what other choice did she have? She could still hear Heather's laughter from years ago, the way she would twirl in the halls when no one was watching, before marriage had caged her in expectation. She had been kind once, gentle. She would never have let this happen. But Heather didn't know, and now she never would. The baby stirred in her sleep, a quiet breath against the stillness of the night. Megan Howell was gone. Megan Carter had just begun. The morning light filtered softly through the heavy drapes, casting elongated shadows across the master bedroom of the Howell estate. A faint breeze stirred the lace curtains, carrying with it the distant hum of the estate grounds, waking to another day. Somewhere below, the servants moved in a quiet, well-rehearsed rhythm, their footsteps muted by the thick carpets. Heather Howell lay motionless beneath the silken sheets, her body heavy with exhaustion, yet something deep in her chest, began to stir. A mother's instinct, urgent and unrelenting. Her fingers twitched first, then her breathing hitched as she forced her eyelids open. The world around her was blurred, indistinct, but her body knew before her mind did. Something was wrong. She turned onto her side, her arms reaching, empty. A sharp gasp broke from her lips. Her hands scrambled across the sheets, searching frantically, pressing into the hollow space beside her, the place where her baby should have been. "Where?" Her voice cracked as she pushed herself upright. The room was too quiet. No soft cooing, no tiny cries, no warm bundle nestled in her arms. Only silence. Her heart pounded. "Richard?" Her voice was weak and hoarse. "Where is she? My child?" A shift in the room. Heather's gaze snapped toward the doorway where Richard stood, his hands in the pockets of his pressed slacks. His face was unreadable, a mask of control carved from years of privilege and restraint. He exhaled slowly, stepping toward the bed. "Heather," he said gently, as though speaking to a frightened animal. She knew, something in his voice, the way his lips barely moved around her name. It struck her like a slow, creeping wave of ice. Her stomach twisted. "No." Richard sat on the edge of the bed, his palm brushing over hers in an attempt to still her shaking fingers. "She didn't make it," he murmured. "There were complications. She wasn't strong enough." The words didn't land at first. They drifted through the air, distant, hollow, unreal. Heather's breath came in short, uneven gasps. "No," she whispered again, shaking her head. "No, Her fingers curled into the sheets. "I heard her. She was crying when—" Her body rocked forward, her hands gripping at his arms. "Where is she?" Richard's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't flinch. "She's gone. We buried her before you woke up. I didn't want you to see it and be more heartbroken." The room spun. Heather's breath hitched in her throat before breaking into a raw, aching sob. She folded in on herself, her entire body trembling as grief ripped through her, violent and unforgiving. Richard sat still, his hands heavy on his lap. Heather barely noticed when another presence moved toward her, Christina. The elder woman loomed at the foot of the bed, pristine in her ivory dress, her expression composed, almost serene. "This is for the best," Christina said, her voice smooth, measured. "Fate has spared you from unnecessary pain, Heather. The child was never meant to be." Heather's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face twisted in disbelief. "How can you say that?" she choked out. Christina sighed, as though indulging the foolishness of a child. "We must look forward, not dwell on what cannot be changed." Heather shook her head violently. No, I want to see her." She tried to move, but Richard's hands held her still. "You need to rest," he murmured, a carefully crafted softness in his voice. "I'll handle everything." Heather's cries echoed through the estate, carrying through the gilded halls, through the cold marble floors, and through the vast sprawling gardens. But there was no one left to hear them. Elsewhere, in the quiet outskirts of the city, Olivia Carter sat in a dimly lit room, cradling the baby against her chest. The child stirred, tiny fingers curling against the thin fabric of Olivia's dress. Her breath was soft and steady, oblivious to the world that had already cast her aside. The old wooden chair creaked as Olivia rocked back and forth, humming under her breath, a melody she couldn't remember the words to, only the feeling. She brushed a thumb across the baby's cheek, the tiniest warmth against her skin. "You were supposed to be a howl," Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible over the hush of the night. "But I will protect you now." Megan Carter slept soundly in her arms, unaware of the mother who wept for her in a grand estate far, far away. The city was alive with movement, the kind that never truly ceased. The morning light stretched lazily across the cobblestone streets, illuminating market stalls overflowing with ripe fruit, bolts of fabric, and the scent of fresh bread drifting from a nearby bakery. Vendors called out their prices, the rhythm of their voices blending into the chatter of passers-by. Among the crowd, a small figure weaved between legs, her tiny hand clutching the edge of a faded skirt. Megan, now 2 years old, had learned quickly how to move through the city without getting lost. As long as she could see Olivia's silhouette ahead, she was safe. "Hold on tighter, love," Olivia murmured, adjusting the basket of cloth tucked beneath her arm. Megan's fingers latched onto the fabric of Olivia's dress more firmly, her mismatched eyes wide as she took in the world around her. The air smelled of rain from the night before, and puddles reflected the sky, turning the ground into tiny mirrors. Megan giggled when she stepped too close to the edge of one, her reflection rippling beneath her. Olivia exhaled through her nose, half amused, half exasperated. "Come now, don't dawdle." Megan's feet hurried to match Olivia's pace. They passed through the market, turning down a narrow alleyway where a modest tailor shop stood between two looming brick buildings. The wooden sign above the door creaked slightly in the wind, its painted letters worn from time and weather. Inside, the shop smelled of linen, warm tea, and the faintest hint of lavender. Olivia set her basket down on a long table cluttered with measuring tapes and fabric scraps before kneeling to pull off Megan's damp shoes. Megan plopped onto the floor, swinging her legs as Olivia brushed a strand of dark hair from her face. "Did you behave today?" Olivia asked, though she already knew the answer. Megan nodded earnestly. Olivia gave a small, tired smile. "Good girl." The tailor shop wasn't much, but it was theirs. Olivia's hands, though once soft from a lifetime of serving nobility, had since grown calloused from needlework. She spent long nights sewing by candlelight, earning just enough to keep a roof over their heads, food in their stomachs, and Megan's small body wrapped in warm clothes. It was a far cry from the Howell estate's sprawling halls and chandelier-lit rooms. But it was home. Across the city, behind high iron gates, the Howell estate was preparing for a different kind of morning. The nursery was bathed in soft golden light. A plush bassinet sat beneath the grand window, white lace draped delicately over its edges. The scent of roses lingered in the air, carefully arranged by the maids. Heather Howell stood beside the cradle, her hands trembling slightly as she reached down. A baby boy lay nestled within, tiny, perfect, breathing softly. Her son. Her fingers hovered over his face, brushing against the downy softness of his cheek. He looked like Richard. She should feel happy. She should feel whole. And yet, as she gazed down at Dylan Howell, her heart clenched with something nameless and aching, a soft rustle of fabric behind her. Christina entered the room, poised as ever, the air around her crisp with the scent of jasmine. She moved beside Heather, looking down at the child. "Now this," she whispered, with the quiet satisfaction of a queen surveying her kingdom, "is a true Howell." Heather's jaw tensed. She knew what her mother-in-law meant. This child, born into wealth, born without flaw, without scandal, would carry the Howell name with pride, not like... Heather exhaled shakily. She had stopped allowing herself to think of it, the baby she never held, the empty space that haunted her dreams. She had forced herself to believe Richard's words. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she would wake gasping, her arms still reaching for someone who was never there. A daughter, a lost, faceless child. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "He's beautiful," she whispered. Christina placed a hand on Heather's shoulder, firm but reassuring. "You have done well, my dear," she said. "The past is behind us now." Heather nodded, but deep down, the past had never left her. Back in the tailor shop, Megan sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, her small fingers tracing invisible patterns in the dust. Olivia watched her from across the room, the needle between her fingers, pausing mid-stitch. She had stolen this child away from a life of wealth and power, a name that would have given her everything. And yet, when she looked at the girl now, a child untouched by greed, by expectation, by the coldness of the Howells, she felt no regret. Megan was not a Howell anymore. She was hers, and no one would ever take her away. The operating room lights flickered for a moment, before settling into their steady glow. Megan adjusted her mask, her focus sharp as she guided the scalpel along the incision line. The beeping monitors filled the space with a rhythmic pulse, steady and reassuring. Years of training had ingrained this calm into her hands, this ability to detach, to focus only on what mattered. She had always been good at compartmentalizing. A nurse shifted beside her, carefully monitoring vitals. "Dr. Carter, we're ready to proceed." Megan nodded, but just as she was about to continue, her phone buzzed in the pocket of her scrubs. Her brow furrowed. She never took calls during surgery. It had to wait. But something unsettled her, an instinct, a feeling just out of reach. After finishing the procedure, she stripped off her gloves and stepped into the hallway. The call had come from an unknown number. She pressed the phone to her ear. "Dr. Carter speaking." A shaky voice answered, low and urgent. "Dr. Carter, Megan, it's about Olivia. She's hurt. She fell at work, and she can't stand. She asked for you." Megan's heartbeat faltered. "Where is she?" The answer stilled her breath. The Howell estate. The Howell estate loomed against the sky, its iron gates standing tall, untouched by time. The gravel driveway stretched toward the grand entrance, where ivy crept along the marble columns, whispering against the stone with the passing wind. The estate had always been pristine, untouchable, a world apart from the city streets Megan had grown up knowing. Inside, the air was thick with polished wood and the faint scent of aged books. It was suffocating in its elegance, a place built to impress, not to welcome. Megan had never stepped foot here before. She had imagined it once when she was younger, listening to Olivia's careful answers whenever she had asked about her past. But reality was heavier, colder than any childhood fantasy. She adjusted the strap of her bag, her breath steadying as she walked through the entrance, her boots clicking softly against the marble. "Can I help you, miss?" a butler asked, polite but wary. Megan squared her shoulders. "I'm here for Olivia Carter," she said. "She was injured." Recognition flickered in his eyes, and without another word, he stepped aside, gesturing for her to follow. The hallways stretched long, their gilded mirrors reflecting her in fragments, an unfamiliar presence in a place that should have been hers. But she didn't know that. Not yet. Heather Howell stood by the parlor window, her hands idly clasped before her. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, pooling in golden patches across the polished floor. She had spent years perfecting the art of silence, of swallowing thoughts that held no purpose. But today, a strange weight pressed against her chest. She had not seen Olivia in months, though she still considered her a presence in this house, a thread woven into its fabric. She had been there through everything, and yet she had never spoken of family. So when the butler's voice broke the quiet, announcing the arrival of Dr. Megan Carter, Heather turned, curiosity flickering in her gaze. She had not expected much. Perhaps a woman in her 50s, someone practical, unremarkable. Instead, a young woman stepped into the room, composed but sharp-eyed, her coat still damp from the humid air outside. Heather's breath caught in her throat. She did not understand why at first, why the sight of this woman unsettled something deep inside her. Then she saw them. Her eyes, one brown, one blue. The world stilled. Heather felt the warmth drain from her fingers. Her pulse quickened, though she forced herself to remain poised. Megan approached Olivia, her expression shifting from professional detachment to something softer, something concerned. "What happened?" she asked, kneeling beside the couch where Olivia sat with her ankle propped on a cushion. Heather could not hear Olivia's response, only the familiar tenderness in her voice, the way she looked at this woman, as if she was more than just a visitor. "My niece," Olivia said suddenly, glancing toward Heather as if remembering her presence. "I raised her after my sister passed away." Heather inhaled sharply, her mind catching on the words. A niece. She had never heard Olivia speak of family, never once in all these years. And yet, the girl's face, the way she moved, the way Olivia rested a hand against her arm in reassurance. Heather's throat tightened. A mother's instinct was never truly silenced. She watched them, their quiet familiarity, their closeness, a bond she envied in a way she could not explain. A bond that should have been hers. Megan felt Heather's gaze linger, but she paid it little mind. She had spent her life in rooms like this, where wealth sat heavy in the air, where people looked at her and tried to measure her worth with a glance. She had long stopped caring. Olivia exhaled in frustration. "You didn't have to come all the way here," she muttered. Megan smirked, reaching into her bag. "You say that, but I can already see you trying to walk on that ankle." Olivia huffed, but let Megan work. Heather took a slow step forward. "You're a doctor." Megan glanced up, nodding. "Surgeon." There was something unreadable in Heather's expression, something quiet yet deep. "You must have worked very hard," Heather said after a pause. Megan hesitated before replying. "I had a good mother." She smiled briefly at Olivia, who only squeezed her hand in response. Heather felt the words settle deep inside her, and for the first time in years, she envied another woman's child. The soft hum of tires against gravel signaled the arrival of a car. Beyond the sprawling gardens of the Howell estate, Dylan Howell stepped out, straightening the cuffs of his tailored jacket. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the grand entrance. The estate was as imposing as ever, a fortress of wealth and old-world prestige. But Dylan had long grown accustomed to its grandeur. It was the only world he had ever known. He hadn't planned on stopping by today, but something, a feeling, a pull, drew him here. He had overheard the servants murmuring about Olivia's accident and her visitor, and curiosity had gotten the better of him. Olivia wasn't just a housekeeper. She had been with Howell since before Dylan knew about this world, like a family friend. As he stepped inside, the scent of aged wood and polished stone greeted him. His gaze flickered across the room before landing on an unfamiliar figure, a woman. She stood near Olivia, poised and sharp-eyed, her dark hair pulled back, her posture upright with a quiet confidence that did not belong to a servant. And yet, she looked out of place. His first thought was that she was beautiful, but not in the delicate porcelain way of the women he often met at Howell functions. There was an edge to her beauty, something unshaken, something unbending. Dylan's steps slowed. Heather, noticing his presence, turned slightly. "Dylan," she said smoothly, tilting her head toward Megan. "This is Dr. Carter, Olivia's niece." Megan turned at the sound of her name, and for the briefest second, their gazes locked. The moment stretched, unexpected, electric. Something shifted inside Dylan, something unspoken and immediate. He wasn't sure if it was attraction, intrigue, or something he didn't quite have a name for. But it was something. Megan, however, remained impassive. She had seen men like him before, wealthy, polished, self-assured. "Dr. Carter," Dylan repeated, a slow smile forming. "Surgeon," Megan corrected, her tone neutral but firm. Dylan raised an eyebrow, amused. "My mistake. Surgeon Carter, then." Megan sighed, setting down the small medical kit she had been using to wrap Olivia's ankle. "Is there something you need, or do you just enjoy making conversation for the sake of it?" Dylan grinned. "I do enjoy a good conversation." Olivia stiffened from where she sat. She knew this look in Dylan's eyes, this playful yet focused curiosity. It was a look she had seen on Richard's face in his younger years, a look that spelled trouble. But Megan wasn't playing. She wiped her hands with a clean cloth and met Dylan's gaze without hesitation. "Then you'll have to find someone else," she said evenly. Heather, observing the exchange, let out a soft chuckle. Something about this interaction pleased her. Dylan, unbothered, slipped his hands into his pockets. "Now, that's disappointing," he mused. "But I do enjoy a challenge." Megan sighed, standing up. "And I enjoy my peace. So if you don't mind." She gestured toward Olivia, silently reminding him that she had more important things to do. For a moment, Dylan simply watched her. There was something about her, something beneath that sharp exterior, something that didn't belong to this house, but somehow fit within it. He wasn't sure what it was yet, but he wanted to find out. That night, Olivia lay awake. The Howell estate was quiet, the halls long and empty, shadows stretching under the glow of dimmed chandeliers. The estate had always been too large, too hollow, and yet it had never felt so suffocating. She had seen it, the way Dylan had looked at Megan, the interest in his gaze, the curiosity, the amusement. It had been harmless enough on the surface, but Olivia knew better. Megan had always been strong, sharp-minded, and careful with her heart. But Olivia knew with a mother's instinct, that Dylan Howell was the one thing she had never prepared Megan for. She turned onto her side, staring at the ceiling, exhaustion pressing down on her. If Megan and Dylan weren't who they were, perhaps Olivia wouldn't have worried. But she knew the truth. And truth, when left unchecked, had a way of unraveling everything. The scent of antiseptic clung to the air, mingling with the distant murmur of voices and the soft shuffle of footsteps against polished floors. Hospitals always carried a quiet hum of tension, a place where life and loss coexisted in the same breath. Heather Howell sat in the private waiting area, her manicured fingers drumming lightly against the armrest of her chair. Across from her, Richard flipped through the pages of a financial journal, though he seemed only half invested. The routine checkups were a formality, a yearly habit they upheld to ensure everything remained in order, just like their lives, their image, and their legacy. A nurse approached, offering a polite nod. "Mr. and Mrs. Howell, the doctor will see you now." Heather exhaled softly, smoothing out an invisible wrinkle in her blouse before rising to her feet. Inside the office, their physician, Dr. Morgan, greeted them with a professional smile. "Your results should be processed within 2 weeks," he informed them. "Nothing to worry about for now, but as always, we'll keep you updated." Richard nodded, his mind already elsewhere, probably on the next business deal or stock market fluctuation. Heather offered a small rehearsed smile, exchanging pleasantries before they stepped back into the hallway. As they exited the office, Heather smoothed down the front of her blazer, eager to leave. But just as they turned the corner, her steps slowed. At the nurse's station, flipping through a patient's chart, stood a young woman in a white coat. Dark hair neatly pinned back, posture straight, sharp, observant eyes. Megan. For a second, Heather's breath caught. Olivia's niece. The woman she had met just a week ago at the estate. But something about seeing her here, in this light, in this setting, sent a shiver down Heather's spine. The realization settled like a weight in her chest. She had never asked Olivia for details. She had never questioned why a woman who had worked as a housekeeper all her life had a niece who had grown up to be a surgeon. And now, standing here, Heather saw something she had not noticed before. Her eyes, one brown, one blue. Heather's stomach twisted. It was impossible, and yet it wasn't. She barely registered Richard's voice beside her. "Heather?" Heather blinked, the moment snapping back into focus. Richard followed her gaze, his brows slightly raised as he took in the young doctor. Megan must have felt their eyes on her, because she glanced up. Heather quickly composed herself. "Dr. Carter," she said, stepping forward with a practiced smile. Megan straightened, tucking the folder under her arm. "Mrs. Howell," she greeted politely, her expression unreadable. Heather turned slightly, motioning toward Richard. "This is my husband, Richard Howell." Richard extended a hand, offering a polite, practiced nod. "Dr. Carter. A pleasure." Megan hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before shaking his hand. "Likewise." Richard studied her for a brief moment, something flickering in his expression, but it passed quickly. "Olivia's niece, I hear." Megan nodded, keeping her answer short. "That's right." Heather, still recovering from her initial shock, forced herself to act natural. "I had no idea you worked here." "Surgeon," Megan corrected smoothly. "Trauma and reconstruction." Heather's fingers curled slightly at her side. Reconstruction. The irony of it nearly made her dizzy. "Well," Richard said, glancing at his watch, "we shouldn't keep you from your work. Perhaps we'll cross paths again, Doctor." Megan gave a polite nod. Perhaps. Heather followed Richard toward the exit, but her heart was still pounding. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. Dylan had no business being at the hospital. And yet, here he was. His driver had barely pulled up to the main entrance before Dylan stepped out, straightening the cuffs of his tailored jacket. He had told himself this was about charity. The Howell Foundation was always looking for new partnerships in healthcare, new ways to expand their influence in medical research and outreach programs. That was the excuse. The truth? He just wanted to see her again. Does this perverse relationship make those of you listening feel heartbroken? If so, please leave a comment, Pizar, below. He had spent the past week thinking about Megan Carter, her quick wit, the way she dismissed him so effortlessly, the way she had looked at him without even a flicker of interest. It was unfamiliar, almost amusing, and it made him curious. Dylan walked through the hospital's polished floors, nodding at passing staff as if he belonged there. And in a way, he did. The Howell name had funded more than a few wings in this building. Then, Just as he turned the corner, there she was. Megan stood at the nurse's station, scanning a patient's chart, her brows slightly furrowed in thought. She looked the same, sharp, focused, impossibly composed. Dylan grinned. "Doctor." Carter Megan sighed before even looking up. Mr. Howell Dylan placed a hand over his chest in mock offense. "Still so formal?" Megan finally glanced at him, unimpressed. "Are you here for a legitimate reason, or do you just enjoy interrupting my work?" Dylan smirked. "Bit of both." Megan huffed, shutting the folder and tucking it under her arm. "If you're about to give me a speech about how the Howell Foundation wants to invest in trauma centers, save it." Dylan's grin widened. "How did you know?" Megan rolled her eyes. "Because you seem like the kind of man who enjoys pretending to have a noble purpose." Dylan chuckled. "And you seem like the kind of woman who enjoys pretending she isn't interested." Megan's lips twitched, almost a smile. Almost. Dylan saw it, and for some reason, that small flicker of amusement unsettled him more than outright rejection. Megan turned back to the nurse's station. "If you'll excuse me, I actually have work to do." Dylan watched as she walked away, realizing something strange. For the first time in a long time, he wanted to prove someone wrong. That night, Megan sat on her couch, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. Something about today unsettled her. Not Dylan. He was a distraction, nothing more. But Heather Howell. The way the woman had looked at her, not just with recognition, but with something else. Something deeper. Megan frowned, staring out at the city skyline. She had never questioned where she came from. Olivia was her mother. That was enough. But tonight, for the first time, it wasn't. The Howell estate was silent in the late afternoon, the stillness interrupted only by the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in Richard's study. The weight of history lingered in the mahogany bookshelves, in the scent of aged leather and polished wood. Richard sat behind his desk, absently swirling the whiskey in his glass, his eyes fixed on the unopened envelope in front of him. It had arrived that morning. A letter from the hospital. For years, these checkups had been routine, a mere formality to reassure Heather, to prove that he was still in control, not just of his business empire, but of his own body. But today, something was different. The envelope felt heavier than it should, as if it carried something more than just a medical report. With deliberate slowness, Richard broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Then he stopped breathing. Renal failure. The words blurred for a moment before snapping back into focus. His kidneys were failing. His hands curled around the edges of the letter, tightening until the paper crumpled slightly. This wasn't supposed to happen. There were numbers, test results, explanations. None of them mattered. What mattered was the next line. Without a compatible donor, survival beyond a year is unlikely. Richard Howell had spent his life controlling every aspect of his world, but this was beyond his control. The study door creaked open. Heather stood at the threshold, her brows furrowed in concern. "Richard?" He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he folded the letter neatly and set it aside, as if that simple act could undo what he had just read. Heather stepped forward. "What did the results say?" Richard exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "My kidneys are failing." The color drained from Heather's face. "What?" "I need a transplant," he said flatly. For a moment, Heather simply stared at him, her breath shallow. Then, as if forcing herself into action, she moved closer, gripping the edge of his desk. "There must be options. We'll find a donor. We'll do whatever it takes." Richard let out a hollow laugh. "It's not that simple, Heather. Finding a compatible donor takes time. Time I may not have." Heather's fingers trembled slightly. This man, her husband, always so powerful, always so certain, had never spoken of mortality before. "We'll get tested," she said, her voice firm with determination. "Dylan and I, we'll both get tested." Richard simply nodded, but they both knew the truth. Finding a perfect match within the family wasn't guaranteed, and they were running out of time. 3 days later, at the hospital. The quiet beeping of a monitor filled the small consultation room. Heather sat beside Dylan, who tapped his fingers restlessly against the armrest of his chair. The doctor glanced at the results before looking up. "I'm afraid neither of you are a compatible match." Heather's chest tightened. Dylan exhaled through his nose, frustration flickering in his eyes. "Then we expand the search. We put him on the transplant list." "We can," the doctor admitted, "but I have to be honest with you. The waiting list is long, and even if we find a donor, there's no guarantee it will happen in time." Heather looked at Richard, whose face remained impassive, as if he had already prepared for this outcome. But Heather hadn't. She refused to accept it. "There must be something else we can do," she said, voice shaking. There was a knock at the door. A nurse peeked inside. "Doctor, Carter, your next patient is ready." Megan stepped into the doorway, flipping through a chart. Heather's heart skipped a beat. Megan looked up, her sharp gaze landing on the small group. She blinked. "Mrs. Howell." Heather turned toward her so quickly it nearly startled Megan. Richard's eyes lifted to Megan for the first time. He had met countless doctors, but something about this one made his brow furrow slightly, as if something about her was just out of reach. Heather's lips parted, an idea forming before she could fully understand it. The words left her mouth before she could stop them. "Megan," she said, her voice almost unsteady, "would you consider getting tested?" Megan blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "My husband. He needs a kidney transplant," Heather explained. "We just found out that neither Dylan nor I are a match." Megan frowned, glancing at the man beside Heather. She had never seen Richard Howell before. The name, of course, was familiar. The Howell family name carried weight, even in the medical world. But standing before him now, she saw only another patient. A man who was sick, a man who needed help. Megan hesitated. Heather spoke quickly, almost pleading. "Olivia has worked for our family for years. She practically raised Dylan. The Howell family has always treated her well, and you—" She faltered for a second. "You seem to care about her very much. I thought, perhaps if you were willing—" Megan studied her for a long moment. There was something desperate in Heather's expression, something almost personal. Dylan, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "You don't have to," he said, but there was no arrogance in his tone, just something softer. "It's a lot to ask." Megan nodded slowly. "I understand, but if I can help, I will." Heather exhaled in relief. 2 days later. Megan stood in front of her test results, staring. She was a perfect match. It was rare, so rare that it sent a strange ripple of unease down her spine. She thought of Olivia, of how she had always spoken carefully about the past, how she had never truly explained where Megan came from. Something about this felt off. Still, Richard Howell was dying. She had taken an oath as a doctor. She had given Heather her word. And so, she prepared for the procedure. The night before the surgery, Megan stood in her apartment, packing a small bag for the hospital. Then, the door swung open. She turned just in time to see Olivia, her face pale, her hands shaking. "What are you doing?" Olivia's voice was sharp, edged with something Megan had never heard before. Megan frowned. "I'm prepping for the operation. No," Olivia snapped, stepping forward. You can't do this." Megan's heartbeat quickened. "Olivia, it's just a surgery." "No, Megan, it's not." Olivia's voice broke. "You don't understand." Megan's breath stilled, because Olivia had never looked at her like this before, like she was afraid, like she was protecting a secret that had been buried for too long. Megan swallowed. "Olivia, what aren't you telling me?" Olivia's lips trembled. Now the truth had slipped out. The Howell estate loomed against the sky, its towering silhouette bathed in the muted glow of the setting sun. The air was thick with the scent of blooming gardenias, but Olivia could barely breathe. She gripped Megan's wrist, her fingers trembling with urgency. "We have to go," she said, voice tight. Megan yanked her arm free. "Olivia, stop. What the hell is going on?" Her mother, the only mother she had ever known, was acting like a woman on the edge of a precipice. Megan had never seen her like this before. Olivia was always calm, always in control. But tonight, she was unraveling. Olivia looked at her, something desperate and pained flickering in her eyes. "I need you to come with me. Now." Megan hesitated, but something in Olivia's voice, the fear, the raw emotion, made her follow without another word. Heather sat in the grand parlor, her hands clasped together, her breath unsteady. She had barely spoken since Richard's diagnosis, the weight of it pressing into her chest like a stone. Dylan stood by the fireplace, silent, his gaze fixed on the flames, as if willing them to burn away his thoughts. Richard, ever composed, swirled the whiskey in his glass. He had accepted his fate before anyone else had. A sharp knock at the door broke the silence. The butler barely had time to announce the visitors before Olivia stormed in. Behind her, Megan followed, her posture stiff, her jaw set. Heather's breath caught in her throat. Richard set his glass down with a quiet clink, his gaze narrowing. "What is the meaning of this?" Olivia's chest rose and fell rapidly, her breath uneven. This was it, the moment she had spent decades avoiding. She turned to Megan. "You need to hear this from me." Megan folded her arms. "Hear what?" Silence. Then Olivia's voice broke. "Megan is your daughter, Richard." The air in the room stilled. A heavy, suffocating silence wrapped around them like a noose. Heather gasped, a small, sharp sound that seemed to shatter through the moment. She staggered back, her hand pressing against her chest. Dylan's head snapped up. His entire body went rigid, the color draining from his face. Megan, standing at the center of it all, felt like the walls were closing in. Richard Howell, for the first time in his life, was speechless. Heather took a shaky step forward. "No." She shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "That's not possible." Olivia met her gaze, unflinching. "It is." Heather's lips parted, but no words came. Megan felt her pulse pounding in her ears. "What?" Her voice cracked, raw with disbelief. "What the hell are you talking about?" She looked at Olivia, expecting, praying, for this to be some kind of mistake. But Olivia's expression was unreadable, except for the weight of the truth pressing against every line of her face. Dylan took a step back, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He didn't want to believe it. But suddenly everything made sense. The strange pull toward Megan, the familiarity, the way she belonged here, even when she didn't. His throat went dry. He had been drawn to his own sister. Richard stood abruptly, the scrape of his chair against the marble floor piercing through the silence. His face was unreadable, shock, rage, and disbelief all warring in his expression. "No," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "Denial." He turned to Olivia, his eyes flashing. "This is a lie. Some desperate ploy." "Look at her!" Olivia interrupted, her voice fierce. "You know it's true. You've seen her." Richard's gaze flickered to Megan, to those eyes. One brown, one blue, just like Heather's, just like the daughter he had abandoned. The truth hit him like a physical blow. Megan stood frozen, her entire body numb. She was not Olivia's niece. She was not who she thought she was. She was a Howell. And Richard. The man who had looked at her like a stranger, the man she had agreed to save, was her father. Everything inside her fractured. Richard's face twisted, anger replacing shock. He turned to Olivia, his voice sharp. "You had no right." "No right." Olivia's voice shook. You left her. You abandoned her. I had to lie to her for 35 years, and now you dare to stand there and pretend you're the victim? I did what I had to do, Richard snapped. Heather flinched as if she had been struck. Dylan felt sick. Megan's nails dug into her palms. You... She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. You knew. Richard's eyes met hers for the first time, and Megan saw it. Not guilty, not regret, only cold, suffocating pride. His jaw clenched. You were a mistake, like my mother said, a curse, bad luck. Heather gasped. Dylan's head snapped toward his father, eyes blazing. Dad! But Megan had already heard enough. A mistake. 35 years of lies, of stolen history, of a family she never knew. And that was all she was to him. She felt something inside her break. Slowly, she turned, without a word. She walked past Dylan, past Heather's trembling figure, past Richard's stone-faced denial. Olivia followed, but Megan didn't stop. She walked out the doors and didn't look back. The city lights blurred as Megan stared out the window of her apartment, her body motionless, her mind spinning. Her hands trembled. She curled them into fists, trying to steady herself, a mistake, a ghost of a life she was never meant to have. She felt Olivia's presence before she spoke. I'm sorry, Olivia whispered. Megan swallowed, her throat raw. I don't even know who I am anymore. Olivia's voice broke. You're my daughter. That has never changed. Megan squeezed her eyes shut, forcing back the storm of emotions crashing inside her. A part of her wanted to believe Olivia, but tonight she felt like she belonged nowhere. A soft knock echoed through the dimly lit apartment. Megan sat on the couch, staring at the untouched cup of tea on the coffee table. It had gone cold hours ago. She knew who was at the door before she even moved. Slowly, she stood, crossing the room with measured steps. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the handle. She swallowed the lump in her throat and then pulled the door open. Heather Howell stood there, her usually immaculate appearance undone. Her eyes, the same eyes Megan had inherited, were swollen, her expression raw with emotion. Behind her, Dylan stood, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, his face solemn. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Heather dropped to her knees. Megan's breath caught in her throat. I should have known, Heather whispered, her voice thick with grief. I should have fought for you. Megan didn't know how to respond. She had expected anger, denial, maybe even an attempt to justify it all. But this vulnerability, this brokenness, caught her off guard. Heather looked up at her, tears slipping down her cheeks. I lost you before I even got to hold you. Her voice cracked. And now I might lose you again before I can even know you. Megan tightened her grip on the doorframe, her body stiff. Heather. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Heather continued, voice trembling. But I need you to know that I loved you. I have always loved you, even when I thought you were gone. Megan's throat burned. Heather reached for her hand, hesitating. I don't expect you to believe me, but please, just let me try to make this right. Megan exhaled shakily. Dylan, silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was softer than she had ever heard it. I was drawn to you, he said, his voice tinged with regret. I didn't know why, but now I do. Megan turned toward him, her chest tight. For a while I thought it was something else, he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. But it was never that. He exhaled sharply. I think I always saw you as family before I even knew you were. Megan looked between them, Heather pleading with the weight of a mother's love she had never been allowed to give, and Dylan standing beside her, not as a suitor, but as a brother. Something inside her cracked. She should have sent them away. She should have shut the door, but she didn't. Instead, she stepped back. Wordlessly, she let them in, The study was dark, the fireplace casting flickering shadows against the bookshelves. Richard Howell sat in his chair, staring at the decanter of whiskey on the desk before him. For the first time in his life, the drink didn't tempt him. A quiet shuffle at the door. Olivia. She stepped inside, her back rigid with anger. Not the quiet kind, not the restrained kind. The kind that had been buried for 35 years. Richard didn't look up. "What do you want?" Her voice was cold. "The truth should have come from you." Richard let out a humorless chuckle. "The truth?" He leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "You make it sound so simple." "It was simple," Olivia shot back. "She was your daughter, and you threw her away." Richard's jaw tightened. Olivia took another step forward. "You spent your life blaming fate. You let Christina convince you that Megan was a curse, but she wasn't." Her voice was sharp enough to cut through the heavy air. "The world never cursed Megan," Olivia said, her voice steady, lethal. "Only you and Christina did." Richard finally looked at her, and for the first time in decades, he looked truly afraid. Not of death, not of the illness consuming him, but of the truth. Olivia didn't give him the chance to respond. She turned and walked out, leaving him alone with the weight of his choices. Megan sat across from Heather, the silence between them fragile. Heather twisted her hands together. "When I lost you, She stopped herself, exhaling softly. "I don't know how to explain it. There was this emptiness, and I tried to bury it, to survive it, but it never left me." Megan swallowed. "I don't know how to do this." Heather reached across the table. "Neither do I," she admitted, her voice quiet. "But I want to try." Megan hesitated, then let her mother take her hand. And for the first time, she didn't pull away. The Howell estate stood silent. Not the kind of silence that came with peaceful nights, nor the kind that accompanied a resting home. This was the heavy, hollow kind, the kind that wrapped around its occupant, suffocating yet familiar. Richard Howell sat alone in his study, surrounded by relics of his carefully constructed life. The fireplace crackled, its warmth failing to reach him. His hands, once steady and firm, trembled slightly as he reached for the stack of papers before him. At the top, the organ donation agreement. His name was already printed. All that remained was his signature. A man like Richard Howell had never been one to admit failure. He had built an empire, a family name that commanded respect. He had always believed that power could shield him from weakness, but power could not change the past. Power could not bring back what he had thrown away. He had lost his daughter the moment she was born, and he had lost her again the moment she walked away. Richard exhaled shakily, running a hand over his face. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to grieve. He grieved for the baby girl he never held, for the years stolen by his own pride, for the way Heather had looked at him, like he was a stranger, not a husband. For Dylan, his son, his heir, who now carried only disappointment in his gaze. And for Megan, his daughter. She had stood in front of him, full of fire, of strength, of everything he had abandoned, and he had called her a mistake. Richard squeezed his eyes shut. What kind of father does that? No, he could never be her father. Not in the way that mattered, not in the way Olivia had been her mother. But he could do one last thing, a small thing, a final thing. He picked up the pen, his fingers shaking. Slowly, deliberately, he signed his name. Richard Howell. Not for himself, for her. 2 days later, Megan's apartment. A knock on the door. Megan didn't get up right away. She had been staring at the city skyline for what felt like hours, the past few days sitting heavy in her chest. She had not returned to the Howell estate. She had not asked about Richard. But she knew. Deep down, she knew. When she finally opened the door, Dylan stood there. He held a sealed envelope, his expression unreadable. Megan hesitated before taking it. The paper felt heavier than it should. From Richard Howell. She stared at the name, the ink bold and final. Dylan cleared his throat. He wanted you to have it. Megan swallowed. He's gone, isn't he? Dylan nodded. Last night. Megan's fingers curled around the letter, her breath unsteady. Dylan hesitated before saying, he signed the donation papers. He wanted to make sure someone else had a chance. Megan let out a breath, a small atonement, a late one. She stepped back, still gripping the letter. Thank you. Dylan nodded once before turning to leave. Megan closed the door and stood still for a long moment before finally sitting down. She unfolded the letter. Megan, I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it. I will not ask you to understand my decisions. I won't insult you by trying to justify them. I can only say that I was a coward, and I know that now. You have every right to hate me. I have earned that. But I want you to live. I want you to carry no weight of my sins. You are not a mistake, Megan. You never were. I was the mistake. You are stronger than I ever was, and I hope in time you find peace in places I never could. I cannot be your father. But I can do one last thing right. Richard Howell. Megan let the letter fall to her lap, her vision blurring. It wasn't an apology she had waited for her whole life, but it was the only one she would ever get. And somewhere, in the hollow spaces of her heart, she let it rest. A month later, the sky was overcast as mourners gathered in the Howell family cemetery. The service was brief, quiet, and formal, just as Richard would have wanted. Heather stood near the grave, her hands clasped tightly, her face pale. Dylan stood beside her, silent. They both looked up. One last time, as if searching the crowd for someone who had never planned to come. Megan wasn't there. Heather inhaled slowly, blinking back tears. She had hoped, even if just for a moment, that Megan would return, that she would stand beside them, if only to say goodbye. But Megan had already said everything she needed to. Dylan turned away first. Heather followed. The past could not be rewritten. 1 week later, the coastal air was crisp, carrying the scent of salt and sand. The waves crashed against the shoreline, steady and endless. Megan stood at the edge of the water, watching the horizon. She had left the city behind. She had left the Howell name behind. She had spent too many years tied to the weight of a life that was never truly hers. Now, she was free. Behind her, Olivia sat on a bench, watching with quiet understanding. She had said little on the drive here, because she knew. Megan had made her choice. She turned, walking back toward the small house that overlooked the cliffs. It was simple, nothing like the grand halls of the Howell estate, but it was hers. She didn't know what came next, but for the first time in her life, she was ready to find out. The morning breeze carried the scent of salt and damp earth through the open windows of the small coastal clinic. Megan stood by the examination table, rolling up her sleeves as she prepared to check on a patient. The sound of waves crashing in the distance had become familiar, a steady rhythm to her new life. It had been 6 months since she left the city, 6 months since she turned her back on the Howell estate, on the ghosts that lingered in its marble halls. Here, there were no gilded staircases, no whispered legacies, just real people, real work. A community that had embraced her not for her name, not for her past, but for the person she was. Olivia entered the clinic, setting down a woven basket filled with fresh bread from the market. "Mrs. Reyes was asking about you," she said, pulling off her scarf. "Says her arthritis is acting up again." Megan smirked, closing the patient file in front of her. "She just likes an excuse to come gossip." "She does," Olivia agreed, laughing, "but you humor her anyway." Megan leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. There was an ease to this, a peace she had never known before. Olivia had taken up work in the town's small library, spending her days surrounded by books, chatting with the locals like she had always belonged. Because maybe she had. Maybe they both had. They had created a home here, one that had nothing to do with bloodlines or legacies. A home that was theirs. Heather and Dylan's visits. The first time Heather arrived, she had stood at the threshold of Megan's home for several long seconds, hesitant, as if waiting to be turned away. Megan hadn't spoken at first. She had simply opened the door wider, stepping aside to let her mother in. Now, visits had become a quiet, unspoken routine. Heather and Dylan came often, always cautious, never pushing. Dylan, no longer the smooth-talking heir with easy confidence, had changed. The sharp edges of his arrogance had softened. He had stopped trying to impress Megan, stopped trying to define their relationship with words. Instead, he simply existed in her life. One evening, as they sat on the porch overlooking the cliffs, he finally said it. "I know I can't undo what happened." His voice was quiet, careful. "But I'd like to be in your life, as your brother, if you'd want that." Megan had stared at the horizon for a long time before nodding. Dylan had exhaled, his shoulders relaxing for the first time since she met him. Heather was different. She still carried guilt like an old wound that refused to heal. Every time she looked at Megan, there was a flicker of pain in her eyes. But Megan didn't need to hear apologies anymore. She just needed time. And Heather, for once, was patient. Returning to the city. The streets of the city felt smaller than they once had. Megan walked through the familiar avenues, past coffee shops where she used to study, past the hospital she had once thought would be her whole life. She had returned not for the past, but for something unfinished. The cemetery was empty when she arrived. She stood before Richard Howell's gravestone, her coat pulled tight around her. For a long time, she simply stared at the name etched in stone. Richard Howell. A name that once held so much weight. A name that had once dictated who she was allowed to be. She kneeled, pulling a single white rose from her bag. Slowly, she placed it at the base of the stone. The wind was still. The city, silent. She breathed. For so long, she had carried his choices like a burden she was never meant to bear. For so long, she had wondered if she had been enough. But she understood now. She was enough. She had always been. She exhaled, the weight finally lifting. "I forgive you, Dad." She didn't wait for an answer. There was nothing left to say. She stood, turned away, and walked back toward her own life, toward her own future. The waves crashed against the cliffs, salt clinging to the air. Megan sat by the edge of the shore, the sand warm beneath her hands. Olivia sat beside her, a book open in her lap, though she wasn't reading. It was quiet, peaceful. "Do you miss the city?" Olivia asked softly. Megan thought about it, about the hospital, about the name Howell, about all the things she once thought defined her. She shook her head. No. She had spent her whole life looking for belonging. She had found it here. She smiled, and for the first time in a long time, she was free. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.